pleased. Well, Richard has done many programs for us, and that's because they're such great programs. And all during the sesquicentennial, that was the perfect time to have him come and talk about so many aspects of the Civil War in the county. Well, now here we are, 150 years plus beyond the end of the war, and we've asked Richard to come today to talk about the post-Civil War era. Richard?
Let me get my jump, because if I don't get this, I'll say the wrong thing. And it'll be bad. Looks like a Baptist church meeting. Everybody's seated toward the back. And this is just a no. And thank you all for coming. It's nice that you're here. And I'm very pleased to come back and do this. It is a very busy time of the year for me, but I took a little time now to make it work, or try to make it work. For all practical purposes, I say that way intentionally, for all practical purposes, the surrender of Robert Lee's Army in Northern Virginia at Appomattox on April the 9th ended what I think was probably the most difficult and trying 4 years in the history of this nation. And I realize that I'm a Civil War guy, and I probably lean to think that way, but I challenge any of you to endure the hardship that both the population endured, as well as those 4 guys who wore either the blue or the gray. And they all endured hardships beyond description that almost are indescribable. And so I think that 4-year period, and I also am one that thinks that 4-year period constructed a nation. I think that 4-year period made the United States of America a world power with a Navy that was unsurpassed. And see, things are just coming online. Metal warships, armored warships, never had been, I mean, this is the first, and they're online. And steam power. Railroads were only 20 years old, 25 years old, very small amounts of trackage in the south, some more in the north. Those things were just coming online. And the ability to use steam power to build things, those things are inventions of the period. And all of them contributed to making gun barrels, to making armored vessels, to making, and when that war was over, the United States of America wound up having a Navy that was, for the first time, world class. And we became a world power as a result of that, or along with that, whichever way you want to do it. Though the surrender document was signed at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon on April the 9th at Appomattox, the actual walk-away date, and I think this is important too, the actual walk-away date, what I call the walk-away from Appomattox date, was about the 12th or 13th of April. And the reason that is so is because once the fighting had quit, these two sides made amends right away. And as the blue guys, those guys in blue, allowed the guys in gray to have a parade at the close of this ceremony where they marched by and where they stacked their arms and folded their flags and handed over their swords in a conspicuously moving ceremony that both sides wrote a lot of quotes about that did a lot to reunify the United States. And the object would be that these guys, the perfect object would be that these guys could just walk home and we'd be right back in the Union, everything would be all set. That isn't the way it worked. and you understand that. And you know, it's interesting that though Strasburg, for instance, we're here to talk about Strasburg, I think of two infantry regiments being important in Shenandoah County and in Strasburg, the 33rd Virginia Volunteer Infantry and the 10th Virginia Volunteer Infantry. Now, there are units that came along later, but I think of those two units as being very prominent here. And the 10th Virginia Volunteer Infantry would have had about 1,300 men serving in it in the course of the war. 10 walked away from the surrender. Only 10. The 33rd Virginia would have had 1,400 persons that passed through its ranks during the course of the war. Some came, some left, some quit, some were wounded, some were killed, whatever. 15 walked away. So I'm just telling you that when we're talking about what came home from Appomattox, I'm talking about, you all remember Gone with the Wind, and you remember those scroungy, louse-filled characters that came home in that movie. And that movie accurately depicts what we're talking about. And these guys were turned loose. And fortunately, Ulysses Grant was magnanimous enough, if you will, to feed them. They hadn't been fed for almost a week. These guys had gone almost a week without food. Just very little bits that they could grab and what. And these guys, and Grant allowed rations to be given to the Confederate Army. They were absolute, and Lee asked for that. And Grant said, okay, that's okay. And that was a part of the surrender. That surrender thing, I mean, if you do that surrender, and if you do that in a very, I mean, in a detail,
Sure.
that is one of the most interesting little parts of the war, too. This contact between Lee and Grant, and what this one said, and what that one said, and where they were, and who carried the message, and why it didn't go, and all of that stuff. The interesting thing about that, I always drift off to these other things, but an interesting thing about that is one courier was ordered by Lee to carry a white flag of surrender to show that they had surrendered. He said, well, I don't have anything white. I mean, he didn't have a T-shirt, he didn't have a handkerchief, he didn't have anything white. And he had to borrow something to surrender. Can you imagine? I mean, that's how bad it was. Anyway, these guys are 200 miles from home. And at approximately 200 miles to Appomattox, somewhere in that neighborhood. And they are turned loose. And, okay, guys, you can go home. You're free to go. And very few of these guys are mounted. Almost none of them had a horse, most probably. And they are in very poor physical condition. As I told you, they hadn't eaten for a while. And they trudged along these broken down roads, fording streams like they had done during the war. And they trudged those 200 miles home, sleeping in fence corners, if that's where they could find a place to lay down, or sleeping in someone's barn, if that barn hadn't been burned. And they begged for food along the way, so they would have enough to eat. And a population that had already given all it had to give came up with a little bit more, and these guys got home. And that's pretty sad. I think that's pretty sad. And the amazing thing, back to the surrender a little bit, the amazing thing is that the total number of those guys was only 28,000. Only 28,000 men in gray received a parole at Appomattox Courthouse. That huge, powerful Army of Northern Virginia that probably had 200,000 men in its ranks over the period of time that it was in existence or more, surrendered 28,000 souls at Appomattox Courthouse and sent them home. Each one of those people carried on his person a parole. And you had to carry on your person a parole. General orders Number 43, issued April 11th at 1865 at Appomattox. I like to read these things to you. It says that all guards, patrols, officers, and soldiers of the U.S. forces will respect such certificates, allow free passage to the holders thereof, and observe in good faith the provisions of the surrender, that the holders shall remain unmolested in every respect. So if you had that parole on your person, even though you're wearing your gray uniform and or having a horse or whatever, you had those rights immediately when you are walking away from Appomattox. There were other places designated at the time during the surrender that paroles could be received, and they included Farmville, Lynchburg, Richmond, and Winchester, as a matter of fact. Later, when the occupation forces came to the valley, and we'll talk about that in a second, Roots Hill became a very popular place to get parole. You'll see a lot of paroles issued at Roots Hill among the valley soldiers, and that's because that's where they reported to get a parole, or they reported to Winchester to get parole. A lot of Winchester parole. Now, why weren't they at Appomattox? Well, that's why there's 28,000. But these guys had been scattered all over the country because the Confederate War Department couldn't feed them. And many of these people are home trying to maintain their horse. So they're wherever they are. But to be on the streets in military district number 1, Virginia became military district number 1. We weren't readmitted as a state, by the way. I mean, just remember that it's 5 years before Virginia ever is readmitted as a state. We don't go back to Congress, elect representatives, do all that United States stuff until 1870. And so we are an occupied military district until 1870. And you'll, as I say, you'll find paroles, and of course people are in prisoner of war camps in the North, and they're not allowed to leave until they take an oath of allegiance loyal to the United States. And some guys really didn't believe the war was over and wouldn't take that oath for a very long time. Some guys simply didn't want to take that oath. Many of them died. They're waiting. But you'll see a lot of guys that are released from POW camps, and their parole date will be June or July or August or whatever of 1865, not April, like many of the others. What did these guys return to? They returned, if they returned to Shenandoah County, they returned to a county and a town that had really been ravaged and ransacked for 4 years. This place, this area of this country had been ravaged and ransacked. That's the best two terms I could come up with. There had been at least 2 major military campaigns conducted in our area. Jackson's famous Valley Campaign of 1862 and Sheridan's very successful Valley Campaign of 1864. And a lot of things in between, a lot of minor skirmishes, a lot of other events that occurred in between. 2 notable events that really taxed the population of Shenandoah County and of Strasburg going along with all that, were the retreat from Antietam in September of 1862, and the retreat from Gettysburg in July of 1863. And during both of those ordeals, where the men came back to the valley on this Valley Pike, America's most modern road in 1860, those men that came back on that Valley Pike were deposited in all of the homes in the town and throughout the valley to be cared for and nursed back to health, primarily Confederates. But the Confederates did not have, though they had a hospital system, and we had a hospital in Mount Jackson, we did not have, as a Southern guy, we did not have the ability to care for thousands of desperately wounded young men that came home from either Antietam or from Gettysburg for those 2 major invasions of the North. And that was a I mean, and here you are at your house, and they knock on the door, and we've got 3 or 4 guys for you. And you've got to figure out some way to clean them, keep them, feed them, and it's pretty hard to get something to eat yourself. And in 1862, I should go there first. In 1862, don't forget that our hero, Turner Ashby, local valley guy, prominent cavalry leader, don't forget that he burned all the bridges. He burned all the railroad bridges, tore all those structures up, totally interrupted the railroad, which, by the way, had run from its junction at Manassas to the Orange and Alexandria railroad. It ran, this spur that ran out to the valley was here, but he totally, well, I don't mean he carried off all the track, but all the trestles were burned. It was impossible for a locomotive to come into the valley. That railroad at the time ran to Mount Jackson, stopped at Mount Jackson, which of course is why the hospital was built there at the end of the tracks. All of the covered bridges that spanned the streams, and the Valley Pike I alluded to a moment ago is one of the most modern roads, and it was that because it was what was called a graded road with culverts. And that meant that you didn't have to descend and find a way to cross the stream and get back up the hill. There would be a culvert and the roads would be sloped up and built so that you traveled on a flat, level surface, which was fairly unusual for country roads in 1860, but the Valley Pike being the most modern. But Ashby fixed that. I mean, he fixed that well. All the covered bridges were burned, and the best they would have would be a temporary bridge from time to time, or a pontoon bridge where they would lay the pontoons in the river, lay decking across it, and cross on that decking. In 1864, let's jump forward to the 1864 campaign. Sheridan's burning had consumed in Shenandoah County alone. Shenandoah County alone. The burning is partly in Augusta, a small amount in Augusta, a large amount in Rockingham, and a large amount in Shenandoah. Basically, those 3 counties are what we're talking about. Sheridan's burning in Shenandoah had consumed 250 barns, 25 dwellings, 11 grist mills, 9 water sawmills, 2 steam sawmills, 1 furnace, and 2 iron forges. They had all been destroyed. And if you were one of the unlucky ones whose dwelling had been burned, sorry, but you got to either refugee north or you got to find someplace else to live. And there are some heroic tales that I have done in earlier presentations about some of the trials of the burning in 1864. So these guys came back to a county that had been ransacked by themselves and by others over this period of 4 years. Strasburg, however, was a little bit fortunate because the burning stopped sort of at the end of Fisher's Hill. Daniel Fisher's mill was one of the last things that was attempted to be burned. They didn't succeed in burning it. They rendered it out of service for a while, but the structure stood. It was not successfully burned, and the burning stopped there. And it seems like it resumed again at approximately Cedar Creek, where the stickling mills were burned down there at Cedar Creek. But that was earlier. That was like a month and a half earlier, and they were burned in mid-August. In mid-August, Sheridan had made a march to Strasburg, and as he returned from the Cedar Creek area, he burned some of that stuff there and to Stephen City and then east to Clark County. So Strasburg, kind of being right in the middle, did not suffer the burning that had occurred, say, further south, Woodstock and beyond, or actually Tom's Brook and beyond is a better description of that. And again, the surrender's over, but that's not really the end. As I told you, Virginia is military district number 1. And that means there is an occupying force that is responsible for what goes on. Every meeting of Confederates, of former Confederates, was denied. And every speech that was to be given, every public speech or presentation had to be reviewed by the whoever the in-charge person in the U.S. Army was. And right here, their big headquarters, the biggest headquarters for us in the valley was Winchester, of course, but there was like a substation or an encampment at Roots Hill, about a brigade-sized encampment occupied Roots Hill. Excuse me. From there, you would have to take whatever speech you intended to give, a public speech, and they would read it and see that it wasn't inflammatory or whatever they had to do, and they would either approve or deny the fact that you could present that speech. And the first guy, by the way, the commanders, I think it's interesting that you know that. There were three commanders of military district number 1. First one was John Schofield. He had been a commander of the 23rd Federal Corps, and he had performed some valuable battlefield service at Franklin, Tennessee and Nashville, Tennessee during 1864. Not much related to here. The second one was Richard Canby, who came from Kentucky. Almost no battlefield experience. He had served in various staff positions throughout the conflict, and though he was a brigadier general. Notably, he was killed by hostile Indians in California in 1873. There's another famous guy that got killed by hostile Indians around. You all know that name. Excuse me. The final guy was General George Stoneman. Stoneman is most important because he is the guy who led the cavalry away from the Federal Army just prior to Chancellorsville, which meant that the Federal Army couldn't figure out where the Confederates were, and that's a whole big story. And that's why Lee and Jackson were so successful at Chancellorsville, and Stoneman is generally blamed for that. And he was the last of those governors, of those military district leaders. Excuse me. And he was notably later elected as the governor of the state of California. I think that's interesting as well. What did this occupation mean? This occupation meant that if you were on the streets and you were of soldier age in 1865, 66, 67, whenever, you had to carry on your person a parole. And we talked about that a minute ago. You might have gotten that parole at Appomattox. You might have had to go to Winchester or whatever you had to do. That's going to be good. An important incident in the county occurred that I should relate to you. Thank you. I appreciate that. Y'all excuse me just a second. There's an important incident that I want to bring to your attention in case you didn't know. And that is the Summers-Kuntz incident. You all probably are up to date on that. Many of you that study local history will be up to date on that. Those of you that don't, here's the way it goes. Generally, and I'm not into all the intimate details about that. Briefly, there were 4 guys who rode from Page County seeking their parole shortly following the surrender date. 2 of those guys was Captain George Summers and Sergeant Isaac Kuntz. And they rode on May the 22nd, only a month, following the surrender, a month and a half, from Page County, and they were riding toward Woodstock, and they were interrupted by a cavalry detachment of 6 or 8 people, whatever they were, there above Woodstock, a little bit south of Woodstock. And these cavalrymen came from the 22nd Ohio Infantry, which was part of the force stationed at Roots Hill. Words were exchanged, a scuffle ensued, pistols were drawn and attempted to fire. The caps fired, but the charge didn't go off. And somehow the Confederates, as they usually did in the valley, wound up victorious and took a few horses and some money from these federal guys on patrol, and realizing they had done wrong, very quickly went back to Page County. And when they got back, they were advised, hey, you guys really messed up. And so one of them's father went over to Root Hill, met with the commanding officer over at Root Hill, and he says, if these guys return the horses and the money and make an apology, is everything okay? And that commanding officer assured him that yes, that would be okay. And so immediately, I don't think these guys went, but the horses were returned, the money was returned, and written apologies were offered, and these were all sent back. Just about 1 month later, just about a month after that, the cavalry arrived in Page County and arrested Summers and Coombs, two of them. The other two they could not find that day, and so they took these two guys, led them across the mountain, and on May the 27th of 1865, they were summarily executed by firing squad at the foot of Rude's Hill. And interestingly, they were executed by the 192nd Ohio Infantry, which happened to get the order to do this. These guys were led across the mountain, led over to the valley there, and shot there on the spot without, no trial, no nothing. And the interesting thing is that the order book of the 192nd Ohio Infantry survives, and I'm going to read the quote from what that order book says. In order to secure the protection of life and property over so large a territory, the punishments for crime were necessarily severe and summary. All offending persons were allowed a trial and counsel, except a party of 4 guerrillas who attacked the forces after the surrender of the rebels, 2 of whom, a rebel captain and sergeant, were arrested and summarily executed at Rude's Hill, June 27 at sundown. And so, without trial, without any chance to prove their innocence, without that commanding officer's note that all was okay, that's what they did to them, and they're making and that's a fairly severe punishment. Today, I think that those guys thought it was fairly severe, I'm pretty sure. And they're sweethearts, and they have these. There still lives the notes they wrote to their sweethearts and things like that. That's all a very moving story. Today, if you go up the Valley Pike, and you should ride the Valley Pike every once in a while, just for that reason. At Rude's Hill, at the foot of Rude's Hill, there at the Locust Grove Church, you can look over to the right, and on the side of the hill is a little marble monument that was placed there. That is the exact spot where Summers and Coombs were executed on August 27, 1865. Which meant that this partisan local group had very little respect for the people in control in 1865.
Nothing's changed.
I'm sorry?
Nothing's changed, Richard.
Nothing's changed. As I say, all assemblages, meetings, and speeches had to be submitted and approved by the occupation forces. But these guys here in the valley found a little bit of a way around that. And what they did is they all became Masons. And nobody interfered with Masons meetings, and they could gather as Masons, and I guess they secretly talked about whatever they wanted to talk about. One of those, and I brought a couple of pictures. I didn't get a chance to put them up. I'm going to let you guys look at them after a while. This is a Mason, and has his Mason uniform on. William H. LaHue. Those of you that are in the pottery business know there is such things as LaHue pottery. There's your man. He happened to be 2nd Lieutenant, Company G, 23rd Virginia Cavalry. So he was an officer in the Confederate Army, prior to when this picture was taken. The other photographs on here are the old passenger depot, which stood right out the back out here. I think that's interesting. Here is a photograph from down over the hill, approximately at the town run, looking this way on Washington Street, showing Polly Wilson's birthplace. Is that right, Polly? Where's Polly? She's there, correct? And looking up the hill, the Jeremiah Keister house is shown there on that picture, and the steeple of the Methodist Church is shown on that picture. Here's a view, maybe these two views I think are really quite rare. These came from the U.S. Military History Institute in Carlisle, the Carlisle Barracks we call it. Here's a view looking east toward Massanutten Mountain, taken in 1885 from Banks Fort. You can see the heaped up dirt there at the bottom of Banks Fort. And if you look real close, the intersection of Washington Street and what we call US 11 or Massanutten Street is here in that picture. The stone house across from Gary Holtzinger's Exxon station is visible in that photograph. This is a picture of your cemetery right here. And this picture also shows the, I don't know what you all call it, the Flanagan Apartments, the Shalley Bates Springs Hotel is what it was called at the time. And that is here. And I studied at that thing, looking at it. The roof isn't right. And I said, it's got to be something. It's got to be it. And I kept looking at it, and I walked over there one day, and I see why now. It's got a wooden third story that's been added since this photograph was taken. So you'll want to take a peek at those photographs. I'll give them to you. You can throw them around, whatever, do whatever. As I said, very little respect for the authorities in control here. Throughout the valley, neither property nor life was safe after dark. Horse stealing reached such a pitch that the death penalty was demanded for it. Livestock of all kinds disappeared. Public property was smashed by vandals. The drifting and embittered Negroes did some of this, but more of it was done by the ex-soldiers, the young men who had had 4 years of taking whatever they wanted. Civil authority commanded no respect, for its representatives were removed or appointed at the will of the military. The new county courts were referred to in the county papers as immigrant trains or menageries. Interestingly enough, it was so bad and people lost so much that there is maintained in the library, and I'll go back to that, to what Barbara said a while ago. If you haven't, I think the library is a real thrill. And I really think if you go up there, you will find treasures that you didn't imagine would have been kept and saved in this county library. And Zach Hoddle can point you right where you want to go. He is a treasure himself. And if you don't do some of your study in the Shenandoah County Library, you're missing something, because it really is good, and there's a lot of good information up there. So I'm plugging the library as well. Among the county records found in that library, when I go up there, I go up there to these same meetings that Barbara goes to, and all of a sudden they'll say, well, one of them will say, well, don't forget that that's probably in such and so a book. And I go, wait a minute, well, I didn't know we had such a book. And they get it out and show it to me, and all of a sudden there's all this valuable information. They found for me a property list of the people whose barns and or buildings were destroyed, and that property list was necessary for them to get relief from their real estate taxes in the late 1860s and 1870s for the property that had been confiscated and or burned in the county during the war. And I think that's particularly interesting, and that shows the level of destruction. It'll tell you whether he lost 2 mills and a barber shop, or 2 barns, or a corn crib, or what. All of those things are available if you dig them out up there. But through it all, and I think there's another reason for that. Through it all, Strasburg, which is our focus today, I think returned itself to a more normal self than most Deep South communities would have. And I think for a couple of reasons, I try to think about this, but I think the German element that had settled this valley built the infrastructure themselves. They did not really, slave labor wasn't really used much in this valley to build the infrastructure that we were familiar with. So it wasn't necessary to have that, or it wasn't a problem to secure that. When it came time to rebuild it, you used the same people that built it the first time, and they knew what they were doing, and so things progressed along pretty good. And there was never, as far as I know, and as far as I can find, though I think there was an active Ku Klux Klan in the community, and I have some evidence of that. I have never seen any complaint or execution or whatever like that of anybody who was deemed to have been out of line and judged whatever by that authority, by the Ku Klux Klan. The newly freed Negro population, which was not large in Shenandoah County, never was large in Shenandoah County. And by the way, if you look at the 1860 census, there are a lot of free blacks already in the county in 1860. And so there are a lot of black persons whose names are on the list there, even in 1860. So all the black people walking around were not slaves, and rather were here working or whatever they were doing. And so molding that and integrating all of that was not a big problem in Shenandoah County following the close of the war. That was, however, the big problem in Virginia being readmitted to the Union. Virginia was the last state to ratify the 14th Amendment, which treated all people as citizens and treated all citizens equal. And the state had to sign off and say, oh yeah, we agree, yeah, we agree. Virginia had a hard time with that. And Virginia was the last state that ratified the 14th Amendment, and for that reason was the last of the former Confederate states that was readmitted to the Union of States, to the United States. I don't really like the fancy new cell phones. I'm not big on fancy new cell phones. I don't have one. I don't know how to do that. I don't know all those things that you all know about those cell phones. But just as the cellular telephone has taken over America in the last, say, 10 years or whatever, just look at the advancements and look at all the things you can do with that cellular telephone that we never even thought of that you could do. In 1975, 76, I worked for a guy, and we put a phone in his car, and that was unheard of in 1976. He was the only one that had one. And we thought he's nuts. He's going to kill himself right down the road. But just think of where we've come. In 1865, don't you see, the same thing happened with steam power. The revolution of steam power in America. And railroads, I don't forget when the steam engine was invented, but it was 1820 and it was 1840 before it was ever really in use. And then it became the means of power. And you could factoryize, if you would, with steam power after the American Civil War. And steam power was fairly cheap. You had to build a fire, get some water, and you could create steam. Steam power had a lot to do with the growth of America. Steam ships. They were not sailing ships then. They became steam-powered ships. Steam-powered locomotives. Steam-powered tractors came along, all in the 1800s. And so steam was a big deal between 1870, say, and 1890. I mean, things were built with steam. And steam locomotives ran to Strasburg. I can remember it. Now, how about that? And I know if I can, there's a few of you in here who have a little less hair than I do, or a little grayer beard than I have, and you all would remember steam locomotives in Strasburg as well. I remember them being here as late as about 1953 or 54. So, I mean, I'm not sure of the date, but anyway. And and production, and so for that reason, the production of things that had previously been done on the farm or done in the household became weaving, clothing, cloth. Those kind of things became much easier manufactured with steam-powered mills or whatever, and became much easier to buy than to homespun on the farm and do those sort of things. So the population changed more to a mass-produced sort of an environment, even in the South. And of course, the South had to rebuild totally, so you might as well rebuild with the current stuff. And that's what happened in the late 1860s and the 1870s. Particularly, I think, in Strasburg, particularly came the pottery industry. And I think, and you know, I looked at the 1870 census, and I got that somewhere in here. In the 1870 census, I think there were 31 persons listed in the census as a potter. Well, the town was only about 850, you know, and 31 of those people were listed as a potter. And that meant that they were the guys that spun the wheel and did this stuff. There's a whole lot of other people in the business, in the trade. Some of them are digging clay, some of them are cutting wood, some of them are building a kit, whatever they all did. And so a lot of the people in this community were involved in the pottery business, as a matter of fact. And I think interesting about that too, 15 of the, I think I found 31. 15 of the 31 were ex-CSA soldiers. As a matter of fact, they're keisters, they're bells, they're sonners, they're all those people are involved in Everleys, all those people are involved in the pottery business in Strasburg, and they had done that before the war, and they returned to that, and pottery kind of bloomed in Strasburg between 1870 and 1890. I think that's when you'll find most of there are probably people that are better authorities on pottery than myself, but I think it would be fair to say that that was what I would call the boom or the period of pottery in the valley towns, Strasburg included. Strasburg, most prominent, I would have to say at that. And the railroad was rebuilt, and in 1868, the railroad was finally completed. The trestles had been restored, and the tracks, you could ride the railroad from Mount Jackson first, all the way to Alexandria, or turn at Manassas and go to Orange. And it was called the Orange, Alexandria, and Manassas Gap Railroad. And it connected with this spur out here to the valley. In 1867, the B&O, under the small name, they used smaller routes at that time, under the name Winchester and Strasburg Railroad, in 1867 began construction of that railroad that ran from Winchester south to what we call the junction out here at what I would say south and west of Strasburg, if you will, to Strasburg Junction. And using that railroad and purchasing trackage rights, they called that trackage rights. The B&O could run a train all the way from Baltimore to Lexington by paying these trackage rights and running on this track all the way if need be. When that happened, the quarries began to spring up, and if you take a look at these quarries, they're all right along the railroad track. And they're all along that Winchester and Strasburg Railroad. You'll find a quarry in Stevens City, you'll find a quarry at Aranda, you'll find one or two at Middletown, probably 3 or 4 at Aranda by now, Strasburg Junction, Fisher's Hill, and all of these quarries spring up in the 1870s not all of them in the 1870s, but some of them, and then some of them spring up and they go broke, and then another one starts, and they're in and out of quarrying for limestone, going all the way from the tracks in Winchester all the way down to Woodstock and even on down Timberville, as a matter of fact. And why is that? And that is because, just like I said before, things that had previously been done by at home, the farmers would have a little kiln on the farm, and they would gather up some limestone rocks, throw them in there and burn them and pound them and spread that on the field. Now you could just go buy a couple bags of lime that had been factoryized, if you want to call it that, whatever you want to call that. And so those things that had been previously done on the farm are now being done on a commercial scale. And the railroad provided the means for all of those products that were local to the valley to be shipped to Alexandria, where there was a tremendous gobbling up of a need for things that came out of the valley, for produce, for grains, for limestone, for pottery, for all these kind of things. And you will find in the quote pottery book, Shenandoah pottery book, there is a map that shows the distribution of the Strasburg pottery, and you'll find that it is where the railroad went. And they would have a car full of pottery, and off it would go. As I said earlier, and in the 1870 census, taking a look at that 1870 census, valuable in the Shenandoah County Library as well. Taking a look at that 1870 census, there are a lot of people in this community then that are now gainfully employed with respect to the railroads. And you'll find people staying at the Shallybee Hotel, if that's the right way to pronounce that. I'm not sure that's right, but it's something like that. The Shallybee Springs Hotel, where Mosby stayed one time, as a matter of fact, and I think he still has the guest register where he signed, which we got to go get that someday. What's that? We need that, don't we? But anyway, the Shallybee Springs Hotel, right there, that building right there. And the Richardson Hotel, later the Virginia Hotel on the corner of Massanutten and King Streets, down at the stoplight, if you will, and the Central Hotel, which would be where the High Neighbor restaurants used to be, right in there. If you look, you'll see as the census taker came down the street, you'll see these people staying in those hotels, and it'll be railroader or railroad switchman or engineer, or that they have a railroad title. So there's a significant number of jobs that are created in Strasburg and in the surrounding area by people that also worked on the railroad. And I think that's interesting as well. So now we've got lime kilns, we've got pottery, and we've got railroads. We've got all of these things going on around here. I told you earlier, 1870, Virginia's readmitted to the Union. At that point in time, we can finally elect our own sheriff again. Guess who the sheriff is? Sheriff is Ezra Eugenius Stickley. There are probably one or two of you old enough to remember the old stone shop, the real old stone shop that stood where 11 and 81 intersect out here north of the town. There used to be a little stone building there. Ezra Eugenius Stickley was born in that house. That was his Stickley home, part of the Stickley complex of homes out there. And Ezra was away in school at Winchester, being schooled at Winchester. When the war broke out, he joined the 5th Virginia Infantry. He was a lieutenant. All of a sudden, one day they gave him a horse, and he was a courier, and he was delivering a message at Antietam when a round, an artillery round, struck his horse, exploded, and blew his arm away, his whole arm away, and but he survived. And so we had a one-armed sheriff. I'm not sure he did, probably weren't quick draw abilities at that point in time for him. But we had a one-armed sheriff of Shenandoah County. He went on to become a lawyer, and he wrote a lot of the claims for the Southern Claims Commission, which came about in 1871. Congress passed an act, and somewhere in my notes, on March 2 of 1871, an act of the U.S. Congress established the Southern Claims Commission. It was established for the purpose of reimbursing those persons in this area or throughout the South who could prove they had been loyal to the Union during the war and whose materials, supplies, or homes or whatever had been consumed by the U.S. forces, not the Confederate forces. If you gave it to the Confederates, you were deemed to have aided the enemy. There were 146 claims filed by persons from Shenandoah County, and you can go to the National Archives, and I've done this, and read all those claims. Very interesting. There were payments authorized in only 28 of those 146 claims. So, most people aided the CSAR, or were deemed to have. Prominent local physicians immediately following the war in Strasburg. I mean, we had doctors here in town. Prominent among those were James Jamison Crawford. James Jamison Crawford was the first lieutenant of Company A of the 10th Virginia Volunteers. They figured out he was a doctor, and I guess he took the right test or whatever he did, and he was appointed as the assistant surgeon and finished the war as the assistant surgeon for the 13th Virginia Infantry. He is the only one that I can determine and he actually surrendered at Appomattox, and he is the only one that I believe would have been mounted. The rest of these poor guys were going out the walk. He probably had his own horse. The other person that comes to mind is C.W. Sidnor, not kin to the Sidnors that we know that live out west of Strasburg. And he was a former hospital steward at Mount Jackson Hospital for the Army of Northern Virginia. And those two guys both practiced medicine in Strasburg along with Dr.
Granville Adam.
Granville, right.
Granville Adam Brown.
Okay, Granville Brown, that's it, yeah. G.A. Brown. He's always G.A. Brown everywhere. In 1890, we talked about steam a few minutes ago, and we're getting along from 1865, moving on up. In 1890, on or about 1885, 1890, steam becomes very important in Strasburg, and the fathers or the leaders or the business leaders of the town, of the community, decided they would build steam enterprises. And they built the Strasburg Steam Pottery, which operated only about 3 years. Along with the steam pottery was an adjacent brickyard and a tile making operation for roof tiles that they made there just in the adjacent lot of what is now the museum, by the way. And that building still stands, and that building was the Strasburg Steam Pottery. There were at least 5 potters that operated steam wheels, and the big deal was you could do pottery a whole lot faster because you didn't have to do it with your feet. You didn't have to do the wheel with your feet. The wheel was turned by steam, and all you had to do was the hand part, whatever you did, and make pottery. And apparently the output was easily doubled in a day's work for these guys. They being very adept potters. Some of the Bells worked there, Saunders worked there, Everly's worked there. Those people all were there. It, however, came on hard times. Interestingly enough, when they started the Strasburg Steam Pottery, they sold 2,500 shares of stock at $10 a share, and it was sold just like that. Everybody in the town was buying that steam pottery. I don't have any of those shares. I don't know anybody that has any of the original certificates. I've never seen one. That would be interesting, I think. Along with that, at the same time, was the steam horseshoe factory that was built in Strasburg. That building still exists. CJ used to own that. That is what we call the big building at Borden Lumber Company. And the most interesting thing about that building, built in 1890 in that era, there are no center posts in that building. That is a huge building. If you go down there and look at that, and you would think that between 1890 and now, somebody would have put a pole up in the middle to hold that thing up. No, that building is built with hand-built trusses and rods and whatever, and it has no center post, and it was built to be a horseshoe factory. As a matter of fact, a steam horseshoe factory. But according to the information that I can find, it never operated and never made any horseshoes. It was built and was getting ready to go, and then whatever the company went bad or whatever happened, I don't know. The steam horseshoe factory. Another building that came online at the same time, all right in the same area, is the Strasburg steam pottery. And I have some photographs of that building. Didn't bring them today, but that stood on the back of what we call the Safeway lot, near the railroad track where the subway store is now in Strasburg. But in the rear of that lot stood this huge, big 4-story building that was the Strasburg steam pottery. And that operated, Strasburg steam flouring mills. I'm sorry, you're right. It was the Strasburg steam flouring mill. And I do have a couple of their bags that came from there. And that, I would say that operated into the late 1940s and 1950s. But you see that power, that steam power, is what was going on. And so the community begins to build east of Massanutten Street. Massanutten Street had been the border of the community in 1860. And Capon Road, Capon Street down here at the Shell station, was the other edge of the community in 1860 from the town of Strasburg. Now there was a need to extend that road, those things down there. So where Queen Street had been the road that went to Front Royal, and you went, to go to Front Royal in those days, you went down to Queen Street, turned left, followed Queen Street all the way down. When I was a kid, we used to come out up on 55, but that was the road to Front Royal in the old days. That this link between the stoplight, going by the subway, going by the steam flouring mill, the pottery, and the museum, those things, that road was put in later and actually hooked up with Queen Street later down that way. Same thing happened with Capon Street. If you were going to West Virginia on what we would call 55, or the Capon Grade, it used to be called, you went down here to the foot of the hill and you turned right and went out to Capon Grade. And at Capon Grade, you can trace that generally back and forth around along 55 if you go. Well, now they thought it was faster and more important. They went out this way, cut a piece of road out to join where Capon Road comes out. And now 55 at the antique store, pizza shop, that little piece of 55 is now the later model link that linked the town or the center of town to the Capon Grade going west, and a much more modern road. Notable in the limestone business. There have been quarries and things that have come and gone. I can think of Standard Limestone. I can think of Dominion Limestone. I can think of Strasburg Lime Company. M.M. Orndorff limestone operation at Aranda. There are different ones that have come and gone in the period closely following the Powhatan. Big quarry operation out here on the junction, we'll call it, was another example of the lime burning, and that was a pretty darn big affair out there at one time, Powhatan, as a matter of fact. I don't remember that personally operating, but there may be some of you that do. I don't remember that. And I'm getting up there pretty good. Obed Funk Chandler. I think he's an interesting character. Obed Funk Chandler built a tannery on the southeast side of Queen Street, on the south side of the creek and on the south side of Queen Street. And that tannery, not on the south side of Queen Street, on the town side, see, right back of the town hall, let's put it that way. Right back of where the present town hall is, in that low area there, was the Obed Funk Tannery. And the interesting thing is that the town run, if you go down there today and you look at where they're getting ready to tear up the little bridge and build a new road through there for some oddball reason, nobody knows why, but they're going to. I mean, somebody told them they needed to do it. Anyway, if you go there where the creek is, you'll notice that the creek goes under that bridge, it automatically makes its sharp right-hand turn, then it automatically turns back to the left. That's done because that was put that way to furnish the water for that tannery. That creek used to run further to the south and came in a more direct line down across the lots there at Queen Street, and that was filled in and a new place for that creek was cut to serve the Obed Funk tannery, the Obed Funk Chandler tannery that was over there on Queen Street. Quite a large operation. I remember the very last building of that tannery that I don't think it's there now, but if you were on the hotel's parking lot and looked across the creek, there was a little log hut building like that was there, and that was the last remaining building of the Obed Funk Chandler tannery. Obed Funk Chandler, Company A, Virginia Volunteer Infantry, another one of those Civil War guys that somehow came home and used the town run for his water supply there on Queen Street in Strasburg. I have the stuff I have read about it, and in an interview I did some years ago with one of his descendants, she told me that there were about 30 people that were involved in that tanning thing, cutting wood or having to do with whatever they did there, stripping bark or whatever they did for the tan. So I think those things are important. Then there is this period of time in Strasburg that is called the boom, and that's when the development of what we used to call A Street, B Street, King Street extended. Those streets that are to the south were built and homes were built along there. And those homes and things are going to date from 1890, 1895 to 1920 or 30 with modern additions in betwixt and between. And also the boom went the other way. As I told you, down where the steam pottery was and all of that Front Royal Road, we'll call it, Route 55 East. All of that building and stuff on that end of town occurred during this boom of 1890, 1895. And so Strasburg grew and prospered during the years immediately following the war. In the 1890s, late 1890s, and early 1900s, of course, the pottery business died away. There are those who say that came about because of the invention of the ball canning jar. And if that's the case, then that's what did in the pottery. That's what I've been told. And so that industry died down. But those guys that did that were being passed by that time, and the labor necessary for that hard work that those guys did had gone. And so the veterans of America's Great War had grown much older. By early 1890, the veterans of the American Civil War organized the United Confederate Veterans. Almost each town had a chapter of the United Confederate Veterans, Strasburg being no exception. Strasburg had what was known as the Stover Camp, named in honor of Joshua Stover, who had been killed in 1863 at Chancellorsville. And I have a list of members of that camp. I think that's particularly interesting. I fool with that every once in a while. And there are 144 names, as a matter of fact, that passed through as members of the Stover Camp United Confederate Veterans, Strasburg, Virginia. I think that's very interesting, as a matter of fact. One of the most important undertakings of that camp, and I got to get you back to Confederate stuff. You all knew I was going to do that. One of the most important undertakings of that camp was the erection of a monument in the Presbyterian churchyard. Very early after the organization of that camp in 1891, those guys recognized and knew that their various comrades from all over the South that had been buried in the fields where they were killed, very much on the battlefield, that they ought to be exhumed and placed in a more respectful place than just a hole here and here one, there one. And they did the very best they could, gathering up 136 of those chaps and buried them under that monument there at in the churchyard at Strasburg. The word on that is that they were, the words on that monument speak that these guys are all unknown, but there is actually a list that probably has 20 or 30 of the names of the people that were buried there. And one of them will say a Lieutenant Jones recovered from the Barb House next to the Walnut Tree. It will say something like that. And there were several of them that I recognized. Mike does an awful lot of work on this stuff. And there's several of those guys that I recognized being killed in the battle at Hupp's Hill that are from the 3rd or 2nd South Carolina. And you know that they dug them up there on Hupp's Hill, brought them, and they're part of what's buried there. So there are some names of those guys. Interestingly enough, when the camp was new, they didn't have enough money for this elaborate monument that is there. And so Joe Funk of Fisher's Hill, who owned the picnic ground at the town out there, where Frabel now lives and owns, Joe Funk said, well, I'll loan you the money, and you can repay me whenever you get the money. And so they borrowed the money from Joe Funk, 33rd Virginia Infantry, and built that and brought those guys together, had a ceremony, put that monument up. There he is in the Confederate Veteran magazine. If you have the old ones, I have those old ones. And if you have those, there is a photograph of that monument and a story about the construction of that monument that is therein. I'm sorry? Oh. Yeah. Each year, the Stover Camp sponsored Decoration Day. There are a few people around that might remember that going on. On which occasion, this is a quote, on which occasion a large procession is organized, composed of veterans, sons, daughters, children, and etc. The most attractive feature in this parade is 13 sweet little girls, all in white, with sash, to represent the 13 states of the Confederacy. And they would march down the street, turn, and go to the Presbyterian Cemetery and lay flowers at that monument. And some people then transformed that into a May Day parade, and gradually the Confederate part of it went away. The other important aspect of that camp carried on for years after the war was the Fisher's Hill Picnic. At first it was a Fisher's Hill family gathering, and Joseph Funk, whose land it was held on, said, well, we'll turn this into a Confederate reunion. And he did that, and the men of both sides, both blue and gray, began to shake hands, re-meet one another in a more friendly atmosphere, and tell stories of their exploits during that conflict some 30, 40 years earlier. And we, the Strasburg Guards, those of us that are members of that camp, try to carry on that tradition every year by placing a Confederate flag on the grave of each Confederate soldier who is buried in the town of Strasburg. And we have done that for probably 15 or 20 years. And so on the last Saturday in May, the last full weekend in May, if you take it right around and look at the graveyards out here, back to the Presbyterian Church, and then Riverview, and of course the old graveyard over here on Queen Street, you will see those graves decorated with Confederate flags. That's all I have, but I'll entertain some questions if we